For most brides, the days before a wedding are filled with magic, last-minute fittings. Smiling through rehearsals, dreaming about a forever that's about to begin. For Molly Watson, that dream seemed to sparkle brighter than anyone's. She was 2 days away from marrying the man she believed was her happily ever after, a man who made her laugh. Who opened doors, who promised her a future filled with love and stability. Her theme? Disney. Because Molly truly believed in fairy tales. She'd spent months planning a wedding that looked like it belonged in a storybook. The colors, deep burgundy and gold, were chosen to feel like a royal ball. The venue, the Stony Creek Hotel in Columbia, Missouri, had that perfect mix of elegance and warmth. She wanted her guests to feel like they had stepped into a castle. Her fiancé, James Addie, was older, steady, quiet, not exactly Prince Charming in the Disney sense. But to Molly, he was dependable, a man of few words but, she thought, strong character, the kind of man who'd been through heartbreak and deserved a second chance. The two met years earlier while working at the Moberly Correctional Center in Missouri. Both were corrections officers, a job that demanded patience, toughness, and a steady hand. Their relationship began with friendly conversations between shifts. Then came late-night texts, shared lunches, and eventually, romantic getaways. For Molly, this was it. After years of struggling through disappointments, she believed she'd finally found the one person who truly saw her. She was 35, fun-loving, responsible, a devoted mom to her young son. Her family described her as someone with an infectious laugh, always looking for the silver lining in every situation. James, at 51, seemed like the perfect complement, older, wiser, someone who could offer stability after years of uncertainty. When he proposed in 2018, Molly didn't hesitate. She said yes, without a shadow of doubt. She threw herself into wedding planning with her whole heart, designing invitations, selecting songs, choosing the perfect dress. Her smile in every photo was pure joy. Friends said she glowed like she'd finally found her peace. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Her friends and family weren't exactly sold on James. They said he seemed cold, sometimes rude, and not all that welcoming. He didn't make much effort to bond with the people closest to Molly. Still, they trusted her judgment. If she was happy, that was what mattered. But behind that calm, emotionless face James carried everywhere, there was something else. A secret, one so big it would change everything. Before meeting James, Molly had already lived through her share of heartbreak. Her first marriage hadn't worked out. And just as that chapter was ending, she found out she was expecting a child. In that vulnerable moment, a familiar face reappeared in her life, Amber Brady. A childhood friend who had always been close to Molly. What started as friendship soon turned into a deeper bond. The two became partners, raising Molly's little boy together in a loving, stable home. For 5 years, life felt good again. There was laughter, security, and a sense of belonging. Molly had finally built something solid, until she took that job at the correctional center. That's where she met James. At first, Amber didn't think much of it. But soon, she noticed changes. Late nights, more distance, less communication. Then came the day she discovered the truth, walking in on Molly and James together at a motel. The discovery broke her heart. Their relationship ended soon after. To the people who knew Molly best, James seemed to appear out of nowhere and quickly take over her world. But Molly believed in him completely. She said he'd been through tragedy, that he'd once been married but his wife had passed away after a terrible accident. According to James, his ex-wife had been on life support after a crash. And after she passed, he couldn't bring himself to talk about it much. It was too painful. He told Molly the divorce had already happened before the accident, that it was all part of a complicated, tragic past. Molly's heart went out to him. She saw him as a man who'd endured deep loss and who now, finally, wanted to start fresh. The only thing that seemed strange was how private he was about their relationship. He told her not to mention them publicly, to keep things quiet for the sake of his kids, that they were still grieving their mom. And he didn't want to cause them more pain. Molly accepted that. She thought it was sweet, that he was protecting his children's feelings. But as the years passed, the secrecy started to wear on her. Their relationship lasted 7 years before the wedding plans finally began. Yet even after all that time, there were still things that didn't make sense. Molly had never been to his house. She'd never met his children. He always had a reason, something about work schedules, family tensions, the kids not being ready. When she talked about it with friends, she brushed off their concerns. He's just private, she'd say. He's been through a lot. He just needs time. But as the wedding date drew closer, those explanations started to feel less convincing. There were gaps in his stories, details that didn't line up, moments where he seemed distant, distracted, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. Still, Molly pushed forward. She was too close to the finish line to turn back. The wedding was paid for, the invitations sent, and she'd already chosen the perfect dress. Everything was ready for her big day, just 2 days away. And yet, something inside her wouldn't rest. So, one night, she decided to look for answers. She typed a few words into Google. Obituary for Melanie Addie. James's ex-wife, the woman he said had died in a car accident years earlier. But no matter how she searched, no obituary appeared. No news stories, no records, nothing. Because Melanie Addie wasn't dead. She was alive. And Molly was just about to find out, but she wouldn't get the chance to confront James. It was late Friday night, April 27, 2018, on a quiet rural road in Monroe County, Missouri. A driver heading down the gravel path spotted a car pulled off to the side, its headlights still shining. When they looked closer, they saw something that made their heart stop, a person on the ground. It was Molly. Her car door was open, her engagement ring still on her finger, her wedding license still inside the car. In just 48 hours, she was supposed to walk down the aisle. But instead, the fairy tale had come to an abrupt, unthinkable end. The morning after Molly was found, the small town of Monroe County, Missouri, woke up to the kind of news no one ever expects. A young woman, days away from her wedding, gone without warning, and nobody could understand why. At first, investigators thought it might be a random act, a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a carjacking, but that theory didn't hold up for long. Nothing had been taken. Her purse, her jewelry, her phone, everything was still there. Even her wedding license, neatly tucked inside her car, remained untouched. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this, someone who knew her. So detectives began working backward, tracing Molly's final hours, phone records, and who she was supposed to meet that night. All roads led to one name, James Addie. When officers went to the address listed on the marriage license to notify James about Molly's death, they expected a grieving fiancé, maybe someone shocked and heartbroken. But that's not what they found. The woman who answered the door wasn't Molly. It was Melanie Addie. And she wasn't a stranger. She was James's wife. Very much alive. The revelation left everyone stunned, including Melanie herself. She had no idea that her husband had been seeing someone else. Let alone that he'd been planning to marry another woman that same weekend. The story James had told Molly, that his ex-wife had passed away after a tragic accident, was a complete fabrication. In reality, James and Melanie had been married for over 20 years. They still lived together in the same house. They still shared bills, family meals, and an ordinary daily life. So when detectives told Melanie what was going on, that her husband had been living a double life for 7 years and was now the prime suspect in Molly's death, she was speechless. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then, as the facts started to unfold, disbelief turned into something else, realization. For investigators, it all started to make sense. James had been balancing two worlds, one with his wife, and one with Molly. During the day, he was the quiet husband, the father of 2 grown children. At night, he was the charming fiancé, texting and calling Molly, planning vacations, and discussing wedding details. He had managed to keep the 2 lives completely separate. He told Molly he lived outside of town, that his home was being remodeled. He said he couldn't have her over because it was too painful for his kids to see another woman in the house so soon after losing their mother. Molly believed every word. Investigators quickly discovered that James had gone to great lengths to maintain this illusion. He had separate phones, different schedules, and even a different version of himself for each relationship. It was an elaborate lie that lasted 7 years, until Molly started asking questions. When detectives looked at Molly's online search history, they found what they were afraid of. She had recently searched for Melanie Addie obituary. That search had happened just hours before she was found. She must have discovered the truth, that Melanie wasn't dead, and that James had been lying about everything. And suddenly, that made James's motive painfully clear. When officers brought James in for questioning, he seemed strangely calm. He didn't cry, didn't ask many questions, didn't even appear surprised that they were there. His story changed from 1 minute to the next. At first, he claimed he hadn't seen Molly in days. Then he said they'd spoken briefly but that she left to run errands. Later, he admitted to meeting her that evening, but insisted he left her alive and well. The inconsistencies piled up fast. Investigators combed through surveillance footage, phone records, and GPS data. They quickly realized James's phone had pinged in the same area where Molly's car was found that night. Then came the physical evidence. A T-shirt with traces of blood was found near the crime scene, later linked to James's home. Tire impressions on the dirt road matched the rear tires of his car. Bit by bit, the picture became clearer. James wasn't some grieving fiancé, he was the last person to see Molly alive. And as investigators interviewed people from his life, they began to see a consistent pattern. To the outside world, James Addie looked like a normal guy, a corrections officer, husband, father, quiet and disciplined. But behind closed doors, people described him differently. Melanie, his wife, said he was controlling and short-tempered. Everything had to be done his way. Former co-workers remembered him as argumentative, especially about his past marriages. He'd been married 4 times, each relationship ending under tense circumstances. When prosecutors later examined his background, they discovered that he'd always been good at hiding things, manipulating situations, bending truth until it broke. To keep his secret life going, he lied to everyone. He lied to Molly's family. He lied to his own children. And even when the walls began to close in, he kept lying to investigators, sticking to his story, no matter how much evidence contradicted it. But one thing he couldn't hide was motive. He couldn't marry Molly because he was already married. He couldn't come clean without losing everything, his job, his reputation, his family. So instead of telling the truth, he made a devastating choice. By the time detectives had the full picture, the evidence against James was overwhelming. His cell phone showed multiple calls to Molly that night. The last one was just minutes before she was discovered. Tire marks matched his car. His alibi didn't hold up. And now, investigators had a wife who could confirm that he had every reason to keep Molly from revealing the truth. Melanie's reaction wasn't just shock, it was a kind of horrified recognition. She'd always known something was off. There were nights he wouldn't come home until late. Vacations that didn't make sense. Long, unexplained absences. Now it all clicked. The man she'd shared a home with for decades had built an entirely different life behind her back. And that double life had ended in tragedy. Once the evidence was lined up, authorities moved fast. James Addie was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Even then, he showed little emotion, no tears, no apology, no visible sign of remorse. He maintained his innocence, insisting that someone else must have been involved. But investigators and prosecutors weren't buying it. Every clue pointed straight to him. Now, it would be up to a jury to decide his fate, and for the families involved to finally hear the truth in court. 3 years after Molly Watson's dream wedding turned into a nightmare, a courtroom in Missouri filled with silence as James Addie finally faced a jury. It was April 2021, nearly exactly 3 years after the night Molly was found. Family members, reporters, and locals packed the courtroom, waiting for answers. Everyone wanted to know how a man could live 2 separate lives for 7 years, and how that secret could end in something so unthinkable. The man at the defense table looked calm, stoic. The same flat expression that friends said Molly had often brushed off as just how he is. But now, that calmness seemed almost haunting. blank underscore blank. The prosecution began by painting a clear picture. James Addie had been living a lie. He was a husband, a father, and at the same time, a fiancé preparing to marry another woman who had no idea about his double life. And when that double life began to unravel, when Molly started digging for the truth, he did everything he could to keep his secret buried. Piece by piece, prosecutors laid out the evidence. There were tire impressions at the scene that matched the rear tires of his car. There was a T-shirt with traces of blood found near Molly's body, traced back to his home. There were phone records showing that James was the last person she spoke with on the night she was killed. They showed photos, time stamps, data from cell towers, every detail methodically linked back to him. And as if that weren't enough, his own wife, Melanie, took the stand. When Melanie Addie walked into that courtroom, the air shifted. This was a woman who had lived under the same roof as James for decades, who had believed in the same man Molly once did. She told the court what it was like living with him, the way he controlled decisions. How arguments always had to end on his terms. How he could turn cold and distant in an instant. She said there were nights when he came home late, offering vague excuses about work or errands. At the time, she had no reason to question him. But looking back, it all made sense. She told the jury that James had always been secretive, especially about his phone, his money, and his schedule. Then, in a moment that stunned everyone in the courtroom, Melanie said something that made people shiver. When she first learned what he'd been accused of, she wasn't surprised. Shocked, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely, but not surprised. Because the man she knew, the man she'd lived with, was capable of hiding things. Bending truth until it suited him. To her, it didn't seem impossible that he could do something terrible to protect his secret. The defense tried to cast doubt, arguing that investigators had jumped to conclusions. That the evidence was circumstantial. That there was no direct proof tying James to Molly's death. But every time they tried to plant uncertainty, the prosecution countered with hard facts. The timing, the location, the lies. Every thread, every inconsistency, pulled tighter around him. And when the jury saw the full timeline, the years of deceit, the double life, the motive to silence the woman who had discovered the truth, it became impossible to ignore. After 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. No one breathed as the foreperson stood. When the words were read aloud, guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action, the courtroom erupted in quiet gasps. James Addie didn't move. No reaction, no emotion, just that same blank stare that had fooled people for years. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Plus 10 additional years for the second charge. Even in that final moment, James maintained his innocence. Then came something no one expected. During sentencing, James asked to read something aloud, a letter he claimed he'd written for Molly. The courtroom fell silent as he began. His voice was calm, deliberate, oddly formal. He spoke about love, about how much she meant to him, about how he'd never hurt her. He called her his angel and said that one day the truth would clear his name. But for everyone listening, especially Molly's loved ones, the words rang hollow. The man reading that letter wasn't the man Molly had fallen in love with. He was a stranger, still trying to control the narrative even after everything had been revealed. When he finished, the judge thanked him and moved on. The jury's decision stood. Justice, at long last, had been served. For Molly's family, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Her brother, who had been one of her closest confidants, sat in the courtroom through every word of testimony. He listened to the evidence, watched the jury file in and out, and saw the man who had stolen his sister's future. When the verdict was read, he said he finally felt something like peace. Not happiness, but relief. But there was also deep sadness. Molly's parents never lived to see the outcome. Her father passed away in 2020. Her mother in 2021, just months before the trial began. They both died not knowing that justice would eventually be done for their daughter. Her son, still young at the time, went to live with his biological father and extended family. They gave him a home filled with love and stability, doing everything they could to give him a normal life, something that had been taken from him so suddenly. Today, he's surrounded by people who remind him every day of who his mother was, a woman who loved deeply, who believed in second chances, and who wanted nothing more than to build a future filled with joy. Molly's story isn't just about betrayal, it's about trust, about how far someone will go to protect a lie, and about how fragile love can be when built on deception. In a way, her story also serves as a reminder: sometimes, the people who seem the most stable, the most reliable, are the ones hiding the darkest truths. For 7 years, James Addie managed to lead 2 completely separate lives. He convinced one woman he was a widower and another that everything was fine. He lied with such precision that even those closest to him didn't see the truth until it was too late. It's chilling to think about how many ordinary days, dinners, and phone calls passed while he juggled the 2 worlds he'd created. And in the end, all it took was one Google search for the entire illusion to fall apart. Though Molly's life was tragically cut short, her memory continues to inspire those who knew her. Friends and family describe her as someone who radiated warmth, who believed in kindness even when life hadn't been kind to her. Her story has become a cautionary tale, but also a call for awareness. To look closer, to trust your intuition, and to never ignore the feeling that something just isn't right. In the end, the fairy tale she dreamed of didn't come true, but the truth finally did. And in that truth, Molly Watson found her voice again. So, what drives someone to build such a massive web of lies, to live 2 lives for nearly a decade without being caught? Maybe it's arrogance, maybe fear, maybe the belief that you can control everyone and everything forever. But the truth always surfaces. And when it does, it exposes everything, even the secrets we think we've buried the deepest.